Hello and welcome to Cinema Subculture, where we discuss everything strange, obscure and downright messed up in the world of movies. My name's Gary. Unfortunately, we don't have Simon with us tonight, but I'm joined by Zach Betonte of the Film Jive podcast. Hello, Zach.
Hello, Gary. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you again.
Yes, a great long-time friend of the show. I had the pleasure of being on Film Jive maybe 4 or 5 times, I think.
It might actually be even more than that.
Right.
When you consider all of the contributions to the collage episodes and everything. So
Yeah, so do you want to say anything about the Film Jive?
Sure. I mean, it's Film Jive at the moment isn't really much of anything. We haven't produced any new episodes since the autumn of last year, and it's sort of unclear what the future holds at the moment. But I guess what the show has become over time is it's shifted away from a discussion podcast and become increasingly interested in developing sound collages and soundscapes that explore cinema from a more interdisciplinary perspective, so incorporating field recordings, music, found audio, philosophy, and then trying to develop original material from that. So I'm not sure how successful we've been in those efforts, but we're trying to explore the idea of thinking cinematically through sound and what that implies.
Fantastic. So today we are going to discuss the 1981 film Possesion, directed by Andrej Zulawski. It tells the story of Mark and Anna, whose marriage is ending due to infidelity, and it depicts the trauma of their difficult breakup. Set in West Berlin of the 1980s, Possesion weaves themes of religion, love, gender and individual freedom into a unique piece of genre-mashing cinema. The film ended up on the Video Nasty list in the UK, making it the only Video Nasty to have won an award at the Cannes Film Festival. So, Zach, this film is quite a trip. I'll give you my sort of initial take on it. I had seen the film before, quite a while ago, just once. But yeah, rewatching it, I really adore this film. I think it's incredible. A unique vision, a real slice of idiosyncratic filmmaking. I feel like Zulawski's really kind of working from his own set of rules. It feels like Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage mashed with Eraserhead or Suspiria, something like that. Real sort of a slice of European art cinema mashed with horror. Very unusual stylistic decisions. The film's got a sort of plays in this hysterical register, way over the top, but I love that. I think it completely works. And thematically, I mean, it weaves so many kind of highbrow ideas together that's sort of puzzling, unfathomable, but it doesn't feel like it's just a bunch of things sort of thrown together in a barrel. It does feel like there's intentionality, even though it's hard to kind of pick out the sort of thematic intention in a sense, because it's so kind of unusual.
Right.
But yeah, it's got dazzling performances from Isabella Gianni and Sam Neill. My only slight thing I don't like is sort of the very, very end, where it does seem to take a turn into sort of genre cliche. But generally I think this is essentially a masterpiece. Wonderful, wonderful film.
When you say you don't much care for the very end, sort of what point does that begin for you?
So like the last 2 or 3 minutes, basically when
the staircase basically.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So when the sort of newly created Mark takes over, it seemed to. Then it just felt like some kind of cliched science fiction drone kind of effect. And that last shot of the teacher, I don't know. I didn't really understand what Zulawski was trying to do with that very last section. Personally, it felt a bit disappointing right at the end, but maybe that's a viewer error on my part.
I mean, there is an aspect to this that it does, in a certain respect, feel like an unfinished film at the end. I know that one detail that he was always frustrated by as a consequence of the camera operator was that it's not clear to the viewer that when the creature manifests as Mark, that the eye color is identical to the eye color of Helen, who is Anna's double, the characters played by Isabella Adjani. But when I've read or heard him speak about this, I'm still not quite sure what that's supposed to imply. Because to a certain extent, yes, it would suggest that there's almost a body snatching dimension to the narrative that I don't think is what anybody is thinking is what's going on as you're watching the film.
Yeah, it feels a little trite after what we've already seen. Feels a little rote. But yeah, I couldn't really get a sense. I've got ideas about this notion of the sort of drone, the sort of doubling, the ideas of lack of individuality, lack of individual agency. I was wondering if it was a comment on that, but it's hard to, in a sense of maybe a comment on the way that communist authoritarianism, Stalinism sort of would make everyone into sort of compliant. It would make everyone compliant and the same, and not having lack of individual freedom. But I feel like that is not justified throughout by the film. I don't think there's much evidence for that, because I couldn't really get a handle. The doubling and the doppelganger thing is a sort of theme, but it's quite a subtle one, and I couldn't really necessarily get a handle on what was going on with that sub-theme.
And Doubles, I don't know, have you seen other Zulawski films?
I haven't actually, no.
So Doubles are a recurring motif throughout his films. And I definitely think the idea of the mise en beam, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correct, but basically the French phrase that is to put into the abyss, which is referring to the idea of sort of recursion within the image. So images within images, like a Magritte painting, how if you line two mirrors again towards one another, you'll see sort of an infinity of images within them, of reflections. And that certainly is, I think, kind of a paramount strategy aesthetically for him. And I think you do see that image near the end when Mark is on the motorcycle and he's riding the bike through the different the almost kind of like, I don't know, the tunnel that's shaped between the buildings, that almost becomes these images within images. So this idea that as he's making that movement, he's falling further into the abyss. I think what's curious about the doubles, though, is that Anna and Helen never interact with each other. And so Helen is only ever present when Anna is not, and vice versa. And there is implication that Helen may be from the east as opposed to Anna from the west. So this idea that the wall itself is kind of creating it's creating a doubling of other personas that then are kind of living in a different reality almost.
Okay.
Like a dream that West Berlin or East Berlin is a dream inside of the other's reality, and that there's sort of this infiltration of those different things. But I agree that I don't think any of that is really justified in how the rest of the film depicts this question. I think that in general, though, why I think Possession fascinates so many people is that it is this film like fundamentally constructed from paradoxes, and in that way it sort of feels like a Kafka narrative, where because there are so many conflicting threads and layers and meanings that one can derive from them. It's like in a way it can't be understood as allegorical, but at the same time it's not non-allegorical. So there, whereas in allegory there is kind of there's the surface plot and then there's a submerged plot, and the submerged plot is used to articulate clearly what is going on the surface. That might be vice versa of what I just said, but because there continues to, throughout the film, there are these conflicting pieces of information. There's a struggle about what the clarity of what's going on. There's a struggle about what is clearly happening. I think the extent of the political context, which I know Zulawski is like very adamant about, saying that while this is a personal film for him, it is also a very political film. My understanding of kind of the extent of that is that the monster is merely an idea, in the way that communism was an idea, and that idea manifests a form, and then it proceeds to annihilate people. Although it's unclear to a certain extent how malicious the monster is itself, because every character that is murdered throughout the film is murdered by Anna. And there's a question of, the title of the film, implies lots of different kinds of possessing, right? That there's the way that in a relationship people feel a sense of possession towards one another. There's a way in which this question of, is Anna being possessed by the monster, or is the monster Anna's possession herself?
Yeah, I've only watched one interview with Zulawski, and I understand that he had issues with the communist authorities about his filmmaking, but it was unclear to me exactly what his sort of view on sort of communism was. Was he like someone who really despised it, that it was embraced the ideas of Western liberalism, or was he still someone sort of on the left who, like most people on the left, completely disagree with Stalinism, but are sympathetic to the ideals of socialism? So
yeah, I've tried to get a beat on this question as well, and he's too contradictory for that to become explicit. I think that in some interviews I've seen him, make the suggestion that he's read Marx, and what communism in Eastern Europe was not at all a reflection Marx's ideas.
Yeah.
But then he also seems to be highly critical of, say, like any sort of left movement
Right.
that seemed to emerge in post-war Europe and preceding. I mean, there is a, maybe we're jumping ahead here, but while I greatly admire him as a filmmaker, I do think to some extent he is a deeply conservative thinker.
Okay.
And he kind of gets around that by being so paradoxical. But there's a lot of Heidegger that seems to permeate his work. I know that Heidegger was a significant influence on him, as was Joseph Conrad, the Polish author of Heart of Darkness. And this film in particular seems to have some kind of preoccupation with like a idea of vitalism, that there's some non-physical or non-chemical force or phenomena which governs humans, and that this is what makes us singular. But then there's also that thing of the idea of the being toward death, which is that death as is embedded in life, and therefore it's also life's horizon. So death is what structures the supposed meaning of our lives. And I don't. It's hard to get a beat with the film's metaphysics. How much of that is a reflection of somebody proposing a way of thinking about the world, as opposed to just exploring these ideas within a fictional context without endorsing them. Because the question when you ask yourself, okay, so if death is the meaning of our lives, then you have to ask, well, what kind of structure of life does that create? Like, doesn't that create a structure that is premised on violence and self-destruction effectively, which to some extent is what we see what is inevitable at the end of the film.
Right, yeah. One of the sort of the binary oppositions within the film is the sort of notion of faith versus secularism. The Anna character talks about sister faith, sister chance. So it's hard to know about sort of, is that a sort of also imbued with the communist notions of materialism and sort of rejecting any notion of spirituality or notions of God. I'm just trying to, I can't really get a handle on how much we should put into the film is inflected by communism, because there's a couple of very significant shots of of the wall and sort of guards on the wall, but it's not over leaden, so it's hard to I can't really say. You could read communist notions into it and notions of dictatorship and authoritarianism, but I'm just not sure how far to go with it. Is it more about just exploring notions of religion and good and evil, and notions about it was interesting what you were saying about the idea of communism as being something that can possess an idea, being a possessive notion,
or that more so that communism as the idea that if we just so much of the discourse that surrounds the movie is like, what is the monster? What does the monster represent? As and is it an alien? Is it some creature that is possessing Anna? Is it something that she is making? And I think the aspect of whatever commentary he's ultimately giving on communism is just the idea that communism is an abstract idea that when you look to implement it in the world, it has to take a shape. It has to take a physical shape, and that, you know, that is the shape that it ended up taking in Eastern Europe, is this malformed
Right.
Representation of whatever was at the root of those ideas. The monsters, I think, in a lot of ways, it functions. It's just functions as a catalyst for the narrative's unraveling. It's almost similar to like what Room 237 is in The Shining. Like, do we really know what Room 237 means? What's in the room? Like, that's never really made explicit for us, but it certainly, our awareness of this space completely alters our sense of the reality of what the hotel is.
Yeah, I think for me, the monster, the primary narrative that stands out to me is that it's a sort of, it's more about love and relationships for me, as a theme that stands out more so than notions of religion or communism, but just this idea of endlessly searching for some kind of perfection. The sort of human, we generally get complacent and sort of dissatisfied with what we have, sort of the constant searching for something better, which seems to be part of the narrative of Anna's relationship with Heinrich, who seems to be some kind of new age philosophy guru. So to me, it sort of depicted what happens when you are in a marriage, and sort of the lack of what you give up to be in a marriage, the lack of agency, the reliance on another person, but you're also you have to kind of give up that desire, that endless searching for something better. And
are you at all familiar with like like shamanism and like shamanic practices?
I can't say I'm really not.
No, you're not. Well, I bring it up because, in a certain way, like Heinrich is basically some version of like a life coach who is like sleeping with somebody who maybe came to him for some help, at some point. But I find it's interesting that he's the only other figure that we know Anna has had a relationship with, because the shaman is also this figure that appears in other Zulawski films. And I almost sometimes think that what Anna is experiencing is like a kind of vision quest, and that the creature is this sort of like bridge to another world. And it's interesting because when we see the monster on its back, it's at one phase of its development, its stomach is like glowing. And apparently, like that in certain kinds of trance states, there is a stage where the subject has to be tortured as a practice of initiation, and that's when the organs of the body are replaced with like crystals, which crystals have this association with light. And so actually one definition of shaman is just literally means stuffed with solidified light. So I don't know, obviously Zulawski has never spoken about that directly or anything, but there is a part of me that thinks that the monster is it's just she's shape it's a shape of her desire, or a shape of her will, or a manifestation of like whatever has fractured her psyche, in a way, but that she's looking for, because I think more than maybe religion, because I do know that Zulawski hates religion. He hates the institution of religion, or speaks very negatively of it. But he does make that distinction between religion and spirituality.
Okay.
And so there is this idea that what religion does is it satisfies psychological needs. And that's, the scene in the church that precedes the Yuban subway tunnel scene, which is sort of like kind of the defining moment of the film in many ways. I think it is very significant that those scenes precede and follow one another, because it does seem as though whatever Catholicism, whatever place it held in her life for giving her some kind of psychological stability, it's like what we're seeing in that moment is that that is failing her, and then thus this experience, in the subway.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting in the making of. The co-screenwriter spoke about how he didn't realise that there was going to be a physical version of the monster. He thought it might be left more to the interpretation of the characters, which I don't know if would be better or not. I mean, I think I don't mind having the sort of physical monster there. I think maybe it might turn certain people into, it might just make people laugh. But I think Zulawski does enough with the sort of the music and the sort of the tone, not to make it too silly. When the monster does.
Well, how else would the film sustain itself in a certain way? Like it begins at such a height already. There's a certain amount of,
it has to go.
You have to keep escalating the conflict, and so to a certain extent, a monster has to show up. Like otherwise, what are they just going to continue to cut themselves in the kitchen for the next hour and a half? I don't know.
Yeah, she had to fuck an octopus in the end, which I heard was the way Zulawski tried to sell it to the guy?
The
Charles Bloodhorn, the head of Paramount,
golf and western guy.
Yeah.
Well, the guy bankrolled the writing of the script. He was like, "All right, you do that."
Oh, did he? Right.
But then he ran out of money. And so then they had to find other, because one thing that's interesting about, all of this talk about communism and how significant is that to the sort of subtext of the film, it's interesting that Zulawski originally developed the film to be photographed in Warsaw,
right?
Which would have still been in the communist state, but then at some point the film was going to be shot in Detroit.
Oh.
And then later Dallas,
right?
And this was largely, I think, just motivated by where they thought they could get money for the production. But it does demonstrate that to some extent, that in his mind the film could have been set in any city. Berlin was not initially maybe an essential detail. I think it becomes one, in the film.
It's hard to ignore that, because it's such a symbolic, the Berlin Walls are such a symbolic thing, like, for this notion of division and separation that permeates the film. So that's interesting, and one of the sort of essential visual binaries of the film is the two locations, the sort of difference in architecture, the sort of clean architecture of the apartment block, and then when Anna moves to her other flat residence in the sort of more dirty, down and dirty side of Berlin. Yeah, that those two look so stunning on film. It's so great to watch.
Well, and also how the camera navigates those spaces is quite distinctive. In the, I think it's the apartment number in the film, the apartment where the monster is being cultivated is Strasser 87, and that camera is constantly tracking away or retreating from the characters. Whereas when you're in Mark and Anna's apartment, the camera always seems to be in the way. Almost, it's like fighting for space, trying to find where it can fit between the characters.
Interesting.
And that is also where there's a lot of, Zulawski had a very particular idea about cinematic space and what the camera should do. And his films are largely aesthetically defined by short focal lengths, so extremely wide lenses, wide field of vision, sharp, clear focus, and the idea that the space of a film should be realized as like a 360-degree space. So it's almost like a virtual stage. And there are lots of things that he does throughout the film with the mobile camera. He's very, when the film tries to avoid cutting almost as much as possible, it seems. He likes long takes. And one thing that's often interesting is the mobile camera kind of allows for this avoidance of traditional shot reverse shot.
Right, yeah.
But that's also, there are moments of that, certainly, but that means that the camera is often looking to maintain at least two characters in frame at any given time. Although it is interesting also that Possesion, I think, seems to have more close-ups than his other films typically do. I don't know what that says, but there's definitely that distinction of that when characters are inside that more austere apartment, they feel like they're caged. The movements are as if they're in a prison, whereas the Strasser 87 apartment, it's a completely empty space, but that almost seems to be kind of intimidating, that you kind of don't know what to do with all of that space.
Right, yeah. One little subplot I couldn't get a handle on is what do you think sort of Sam Neill's job as is he some kind of spy? Does that have any kind of relevance to the plot, or is it just a little like side thing? Because one interpretation I thought of was that his refusal to take the job at the start was the thing that sort of spun the whole thing, his whole life out of control. But I don't know if that's a kind of sort of trite, sort of rather banal.
Well, no, actually, the Margie character, the character who has the cast on her foot, she does say to Mark, I think at some point, that Anna thought he wouldn't be coming back as soon as he did.
Right.
That he would be kind of interred somewhere else. That they would move him to another job. So in a certain way, his deciding to quit does mean that now these things that have been happening while he's been gone can't go unnoticed anymore. But I do think, I don't, sometimes I wonder, like with that subplot, if it's just an attempt to justify like the competency of his actions later in the film. like there's a certain, that character has a sort of like an epiphany, and then his entire attitude about what's going on shifts.
The Mark character.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
It's when he goes to the apartment and finds the decapitated body parts in the refrigerator. He has I don't know if it is like a crisis of faith or whatever, but he then has a completely different attitude from that point forward about how he's going to navigate the situation. And he's, he does not seem particularly overwhelmed by that point anymore.
Yeah,
like he knows exactly what he needs to do. Like he's being a good soldier.
Yeah.
But I also wonder about how that spy plot does imply his freedom of movement as opposed to Anna's. That he is not actually contained by the wall itself. So he does not feel caged in the way that she does. Because it is expressed that he was on the eastern side of the wall.
Right, yeah.
And now he's come back. And so there's a way in which he's able to move much more freely throughout the city than she is. I mean, I also think that aspect of the plot may also reflect some of what we were talking about with the film's political context. I know that in the commentary track, the pink socks are something that come up as simply being a detail, because I think when you first see the film, the character at the end who has the pink socks, you think he's some kind of double agent,
right? Because the pink socks is mentioned only twice, I think, at the start and then at the end.
Right. Well, it's mentioned, and then we just see the pink socks at the end, right?
Okay.
So we're meant to think that these people are one and the same, but that character is also in the room when the pink socks are and he's actually wearing pink socks in that scene as well, if you look. So I think what Zulawski said about that was just they just want to know what people are wearing on the other side of the wall, because they're so insulated in a way.
Right. Okay.
And that there's a kind of they want to be as much like the West as they can, or what have you. I sometimes get confused about which side of the wall we're on throughout the film. Whether we're on the western side or the eastern side, because
can we objectively say it is only the western side, or is that open to interpretation?
Oh yeah, no, I definitely think that both apartments are only on on one side of the wall. It's just that sometimes it's mainly when I read or hear other people speak about the film that it seems like they start confusing which side, and then I get increasingly confused. But yet my understanding is we're on the western side of the wall for the duration of the film. And so anyway, it's that those characters are looking like, well, what is everybody else doing? If wearing pink socks is like the new hip thing because we're so insulated, then we're gonna start wearing pink socks, because we want to be, so.
So it's just a kind of minor detail. It's not that important.
Yeah, well, that's something I wanted actually to bring up, because there are quite a few of those little details throughout the film. You've only seen the film twice, correct?
3 times in total.
Oh, 3 times. Yeah. Okay, so there's one detail I actually wanted to ask you about, because I didn't really notice this. I think I've probably seen the film maybe like a dozen times now. But I didn't notice this until several viewings in. The chase sequence between Anna and the private detective when she reaches the Strasser apartment.
I love that.
She enters.
Hysterical, but also terrifying. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. He kicks an object that is lying in the street.
Oh, the head? Is that a head?
Yeah, the decapitated head, right. Yeah, okay, so you did notice. Right. So I find this moment like really fascinating. Like it's like become a moment in the film that I kind of obsess about.
Right.
Because it's at the time that it happens in the film, it feels entirely incidental. Like, and like I said, initially, when he kicks the thing, I thought it was just like just something sitting in the street, like a piece of garbage or whatever. So it feels entirely incidental in that moment. Then later we learn of the dismembered bodies in the apartment, so we could perhaps assume this head is the consequence of he's another character who's met a similar fate. But I think what I like about these kinds of gestures is that I find that they articulate that the world of the film has a life of its own beyond the story we're being told. The drunkard on the train who takes the banana from a grocery bag, I think, would also be an example of this. And so it's just we could try to connect it to this her work. It's an artifact of her work, but I also think it's maybe just an embodiment of the surrealism that is present throughout the film, and may reflect that in this world of the film, it is not uncommon for decapitated heads to just lie in the street, because there is this weird way in which all of this, as the film kind of ramps up, there's all of this violence going on. And like hardly anybody seems to be paying any attention to it. It still very much feels like these characters are in their own little world.
The implication of him kicking the head must be that this isn't that uncommon for a decapitated head to be lying about. Unless he kicked it, he didn't realise it was a head.
But it's definitely something that the filmmaker wants us to take note of. Because you wouldn't have him kick the head if you didn't want people to notice it. So it's it's definitely. I mean, he's expressing his frustration with his exhaustion with this following her around, which is just, that whole sequence is quite hilarious. Just the way he, in a certain way, he's like really bad at following somebody and not being noticed, even though she never gives attention to him in all of those scenes. She never looks at him. So there is a way in which that whole sequence is played, which is like, does she know he's following her, or is she eager to get to the apartment? But then you're thinking like, he's really incompetent at doing this.
One thing that struck me about all the main characters is they have this sort of fluctuation between no agency and then they kind of are able to take control of the situation, and they seem to be out of control and then in control. And I love how Zulawski like lets the narrative progress, the storytelling, to keep the audience like unaware that actually who's actually the sort of power broker in this situation. Because especially at first, the Heinrich character seems to be a power player, and then you see him like totally lose it all. Mark at first has no idea what's going on. Then, as you were saying about after he gets to the apartment, he seems to have like a real direct kind of notions of what the direction of travel. The Anna character, when she's actually starting to commit murders, seems to be like a very strong character. So I love that, this sort of ebb and flow that we get from this movie. It really keeps you guessing, keeps you on your toes as a viewer.
Do you think that is more a consequence of maybe the content of the narrative, or do you think that's more so maybe a consequence of the performances themselves and the way that the performances seem to almost evolve in throughout the film themselves? There's Zulawski is performance is, I think, probably the primary aspect of maybe his entire like maybe formal approach, which is this idea that performance is a form of discovery, that you're not supposed to know what you're doing. as you're acting.
That's what I think. Did he say something like that about the subway scene? Where did he not say that he didn't give Ajani any kind of direction? Is that true?
Well, he told her. I mean, quite crudely, he says he told her to fuck the air.
Oh, right.
that was the extent of it.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, whenever directors speak like that, you have to, I think, take it with a grain of salt, because I've read also elsewhere him be ask that question about that particular scene and say, "I will not tell you because that would give you too much insight into my craft," basically. Right, so there is this weird way that filmmakers want to maintain the secret of everything that they do.
Yeah. But answering your question, it seems like it is part of the narrative intent that sort of the sort of lack of certainty about what's actually going on. But it seems that he did also give the performers a very wide latitude to kind of interpret it as they will. But yeah, adds up to a great cocktail.
Well, it's the performances throughout the film are something I find really interesting. Just that in how scenes are blocked or how they're formally organized with the actors seems particularly singular for a kind of I don't know. I'm always kind of uncomfortable with maybe calling this a genre movie, just because I'm not sure what kind of expectations that gives an audience about it. But it's almost like obviously there's a script and each scene has a script, but the way that the scenes are played almost seem as though they're being given different prompts.
Okay.
The actors are given differing directives in the scene. Like there's a very amusing scene when Mark first goes to hire the private detective, and the swiveling of the chairs. And Mark is swiveling in the chair, and then the private detective starts swiveling in his chair. Okay. And so at some point they're both swiveling in their chairs. And it's almost like one actor was told to swivel and the other actor was told to mirror what the other actor was doing.
Okay.
And these are, strategies in performance. That is a kind of acting exercise that you would engage in. There's also the scenes later, also with the private detective, the clenching of the hands, the holding of each other's hands as they're talking to each other. And the way that scene, Mark takes his hands and is sort of like, I don't have any ambition left. And the private detective then takes that gesture to mean something more. And then Sam Neill kind of plays Mark. Then he suddenly starts to recoil. That there are these kind of different strategies that get employed within scenes that maybe just on the face of them might seem very banal or almost expository, but because of the way that the actors play the scenes, they are given sort of this other layer of I don't know, meaning or suggestion, and that is something that's just kind of reiterated throughout the film, like the meat grinder scene in the kitchen, which is also another great scene. It almost seems as though the way that is directed is it's like, okay, Anna's gonna go into the kitchen, Mark's gonna come in, and like your job is just to obstruct her at every turn, just get in her way. And then Anna, you've got to figure out how to get around him.
Right.
And then, once she's at the counter with the cutting board, it's like she never speaks another line of dialogue throughout the scene. And he never makes eye contact with her. So there are just these different directives that I feel like are given in the performances that I think just kind of really broaden the scope of the film and make it a much richer experience.
Definitely, yeah.
But I guess with that, we have to then talk about the subway scene.
Of course.
The fuck the air. So,
yeah, I mean, wow. Disturbing, mesmerizing, disgusting, still full of power, like to this day.
Yeah, I mean, I think I find it sometimes useful to think of it as that we're watching a trance, or like a ritual of a trance.
What I love about it is, I think the sound adds a lot of so much as well. Like the echo of the actual subway tunnel makes it so much kind of eerie and disturbing as well.
Well, that reminds me that something I noticed recently revisiting the film is that the presence of echoes recur also in the sound design throughout the film. Even when she's in the apartment, there are moments when she screams at him that I don't feel anything for anybody. There is actually like a delay applied to that line. And so if you have the sound turned up loud enough, you can hear that repeat itself as it's fading away. And so there are lots of moments where particularly with her character, there is this repetition of her dialogue, but it's very faint. The subway sequence is interesting because a lot of people, and even she explicitly says this in the film, that it's a scene of miscarriage. But the fluids aren't just secreting from her crotch. The fluids are secreting from her mouth, from her ears. I mean, there's fluid being secreted all over the place.
Yeah. She explicitly says, was it she excreted chance or faith? I can't remember now.
She secretes faith.
Okay.
Sure. Oh, one other thing I wanted to ask you, if you don't have anything, is it's interesting that this film really lied in obscurity for 30 years, until about 8 or 9 years ago. Zulawski kind of had this revival, at least in North America. And so I was curious why you think maybe this film has subsequently found such a devoted audience to it so many years after the fact.
I guess it feels to me like completely, within its own world. It's quite a unique piece. There's things you can compare it to, but it feels like not many directors would choose this, these stylistic decisions, these genre mashing decisions, these directorial decisions, performance decisions that feel like unique to him. I think in the UK it maybe had more of a presence because of its place on the Video Nasty list. Are you aware of the whole Video Nasty scandal that happened in the UK?
Yes, but I don't know. I don't know specifically what they said about this film in particular.
Yeah, it's hard to say because we don't exactly know the reasons why films were on the list. We don't even. There may have been someone watched it. The police watched it, or someone reported it. But it may have just been because it was called Possesion and it had like a naked lady on the cover, and they thought, right, we need to. No one can see this, because I think it is weird that it's on the list amongst like the most cheap, grimy exploitation movies. It stands on its own as a European art piece. That there's nothing else like that on the list. But yeah, maybe that gave it more let people seek it out in the UK more than North America. But I didn't know it didn't have it. It wasn't like that well known over there.
Its release in North America is interesting because the film was re-edited for the North American release. So there is an 81-minute version that exists that I actually was trying to find before recording this episode because I was kind of curious to see it. But it's virtually, it seems impossible to locate at this point because nobody really wants to look at it. I think it might have had they replaced the score as well in that version, but I mean, it's funny that this film, when it came out, Time Out magazine described it as the film that nobody likes. So it wasn't. It was pretty universally, I think, dismissed, and then BAM's retrospective Hysterical Excess, which was this retrospective of Zulawski's films. Kind of gave new life to his career among, I think, younger cinephiles, and then this film has since become. It seems as though it's nearly like people all call it like their favorite horror film, but I agree. I do think it is that there is it does give you the impression of like a singularity in cinema, that there really is nothing quite like it.
Is it even, how does it compare to his other his filmography? Is it similar, or is it still like quite a unique piece?
Well, the performance styles are very much in keeping with the performances in his other films, and Zulawski is very much a surrealist in certain respects. So not maybe in the sense of the word as we like with someone like David Lynch. I don't think his films are as like open texts as David Lynch's films are. But certainly like in surrealism in the more sort of like European tradition, maybe a fabulist. So there is the presence of otherworldly figures that appear, particularly in the earlier Polish films. When he begins to work in France, those films are maybe a bit more comparable to something like 60s Godard.
Okay, right.
In that they become increasingly reflexive, this idea that a film being made within a film, and that literally sort of kind of reaches its heights with his opera film, which is an opera that is where you see all of the crew and the lights in the frames,
right,
as it's happening. So you're very aware of the fact that a film is being made. So Possession isn't reflexive in that respect, but I certainly think it shares a lot with his other work. No sex with octopuses.
Right, okay.
So I don't think that happens again. Maybe that's the standout.
Right. Fantastic. Okay, so that'll do it for our discussion of Possession. So Zach, thanks very much for joining me on this episode.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Where could folks go to find some Film Jive content if they would like to check it?
The website is filmjivepodcast.com. We're also on YouTube as well, just Film Jive Podcast.
Excellent. So you've been listening to Cinema Subculture. If you like more of this content, please make sure you've subscribed on YouTube, like the video and hit the notification bell.